All right, here we go. Welcome, everyone, to our event today focused on the theory of change of the Alliance for Responsible Capitalism, or what I like to call the hidden carbon footprint, why corporate political responsibility is the key to tackling the climate crisis. So we're a smaller group today. We'll have a discussion where we can, but I think we're having a good recording, so we'll be able to share this with other folks who weren't able to join today. So who are we? What is ARC? Well, my name is Amy Goebel. I am a co-founder of the Alliance for Responsible Capitalism. My day job is at Johnson & Johnson in pharmaceutical process innovation, but a big part of my heart is with this nonprofit. So how did this get started? Um, Flashback to 2021 when uh, when there seemed to be a fairly strong consensus that a certain size of company that wanted to project a pro-social image needed to have a carbon commitments. Um, Nike, Alphabet, Walmart, Johnson and Johnson, Amazon. These are even British American Tobacco, right, had net zero commitments. But also going on in 2021 was the debates, the discussions around the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most important piece of climate legislation in US history. And in my J&J role, I discovered that we J&J, were showing up on a list of companies who had ambitious climate goals, but were contributing to blocking the IRA either through inaction or actually supporting organizations that were lobbying against it. That was a tracker that was put together by an organization called Climate Voice. And that seemed like a big deal to us, right? You have a big focus on corporate sustainability, but in one of the most important pieces of climate legislation, you have companies that are working against it. And that was certainly a gap in the conversation about sustainable business. I mean, I did an MBA with a sustainability focus, and that didn't come up in our curriculum. So we created the Alliance for Responsible Capitalism, or ARC, with the goal of aligning corporate political influence with sound climate policy and focusing on that piece of business education. Early on, we got connected with a team at the University of Michigan that was developing the corporate political responsibility framework to address exactly this problem. And what we hope to persuade you of today is that policy is key to tackling climate change, that companies have an important role to play in this change, that CPR, or corporate political responsibility, is a powerful framework for guiding political activities, and that you as students are a critical catalyst in this change. So first, little bit of interaction. What is the current state of climate? Just to, ground us in the feels and the doom and gloom.
Don't think it's being taken seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Not enough action, not moving with the speed that is called upon. Yeah. Um, Praveen, any other headlines?
Very local or international, but never nothing in the middle, really, other than the
Hmm.
IRA.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That you might have cities taking on leadership roles. You might have UN global initiatives like the global um, financial institutions for net zero. I'm G fans, I can't remember what the A stands for. Um, but those large international institutions, but maybe less leadership happening at a national level. Yeah, I see that. Um, it's I the optimistic part of me sees more and more natural disasters affecting more and more people, and that is a source for optimism because I feel like those are the moments that actually get people turned on to the reality of climate change, that it is not something in the future anymore. It is something that's happening here and now. I feel like the wildfires in Los Angeles this year were something that really made it very tangible and visceral for a lot of people. And that, you know, 10 years ago already, we had global consensus that climate change is happening. It is a bad thing. We want to prevent climate change. We want to keep warming to well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5, because 97% of scientists agree that humans are the cause of climate change, which is primarily driven by fossil fuels, and therefore humans have a responsibility to do something about it. As I was refreshing the content for this presentation, I came across the unsettling fact that yes, 2024 is the first year that we've exceeded 1.5 degrees. But every little bit matters. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN convened body tasked with summarizing the latest thinking on climate science, put out a report looking at exactly this, right? Even if we surpass 1.5, what difference does it make, right? If we've missed that target, then what? And you can see the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is a substantial amount of ecological damage and human suffering. We double the amount of the world population exposed to water shortages. We increase the population exposed to drought by several million people. It gets worse. And with every tenth of a degree, the consequences get worse, the suffering gets worse. But the money is actually betting on 3 degrees of warming. I'm not sure if you saw this headline, but Morgan Stanley slipped into an otherwise banal analysis recommending investment in air conditioning stocks, that they are now counting on 3 degrees of warming. We saw the difference between 1.5 and 2, and between 2 and 3, we get predictions of the end of capitalism. And this is a quotation that is worth reading through in full. Once we reach 3 degrees Celsius of warming, the situation locks in. At that point, risk cannot be transferred, no insurance. Risk cannot be absorbed, no public capacity, I'm meaning government can't step in. And risk cannot be adapted to, physical limits are exceeded. That means no more mortgages, no new real estate development, and no long-term investment, no financial stability. The financial sector as we know it ceases to function, and with it, capitalism as we know it ceases to be viable. And this is not coming from a climate scientists, it's not coming from activists, it is coming from the former head, the former CEO of Allianz, the largest insurance company in the world. They are seeing that the underpinnings of the financial system will no longer work when we reach that level of warming. But maybe, so think about that as imagining yourself in the boardroom of a company, right? The human suffering, the coral reefs, that's a hard case to make. But the end of capitalism and the inability for companies to continue to make a reliable profit may be a compelling business argument. So, what do we do about it? And specifically, what should companies do? And this is where I'm going to put you guys on the spot again. What actions should companies take to address climate change?
I think companies have the ability to influence policy and be influenced by policy. But I think that like companies really following what their customers are asking for and being like leaders in this space, I think that can have significant change in changing the public persona of climate change and really shifting the culture.
Hmm. So allowing themselves to tap into the signal that they're getting from their customer base that sustainability is important. I think, yeah, absolutely. We see generational trends in increasing interest in climate change. I guess my challenge there is um, at the same time we see incentives work, and a lot of people say they want to invest in sustainability or buy sustainable products, but then make that marginal decision on the basis of cost rather than on the basis of sustainability. And that becomes a complex equation. And you have a lot of customers that don't yet agree that climate change is anthropogenic and something that companies should be acting on. So it's, yeah, we want more of that market signal. We want companies to be responding to that. But when being unsustainable is still cheaper in the short term, how do companies deal with that? And that's what you said at the beginning. You got to my punchline, which is around the role of companies in influencing the policy space. Um, any other any other ideas to throw out about what companies should be doing specifically on climate?
I think adding to the point that she made about influencing policy, specifically to the point of, okay, customers want sustainability, companies want to be sustainable to meet their customer needs, but to your point of, okay, if the customer is going to choose between something cheaper or something more green, they will probably choose cheaper because there are not externalities baked into the price. And the way you do that is through policies. I think if they take the policy bend specifically towards embedding externality costs into their products, into their supply chains, I think that can be a good way to make that work. And I guess one of the few pros of a very uh, what's the word for when you acquire every company in the world. Um,
Monopolistic?
yeah, one of the pros is that that a few players can do a lot of good in that sense
Mhm.
for driving the change.
So we want more monopolies. That's the answer.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I do love preaching to the choir, but for the purpose of playing this out and helping you build your own repertoire of tools in making this argument, I'm going to engage one of my favorite climate tools, which is the En-ROADS climate simulation model developed by an organization called Climate Interactive and the MIT Management Sustainability Initiative. Um, can can you now see the En-ROADS model? Okay, great. We're following my screen. So this is a global climate simulation model to help us understand the impact of different actions that we can take to address climate change. And I like using this to ask, uh, is it enough? What are the actions we're talking about, and do they go far enough to help us stay well below 2 degrees of warming, or ideally at 1.5? So on the left, we can see different emission sources from energy, essentially the inputs to our climate system. And on the right, we see net greenhouse gas emissions and the temperature increase predicted by 2100, which are basically the outputs. And this is the baseline scenario on our current trajectory. And we see that we are indeed predicting above 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And because we continue to emit net greenhouse gas emissions, this is still the concentration of greenhouse gases continues to increase in the atmosphere, and therefore clock doesn't stop at 2100. The planet will continue to warm. And below the graphs, we have sliders looking at different types of actions we can take, and we can look quickly at some scenarios that would be relevant for businesses. Um, so when I look at, typical companies' climate action plan, they are focused on scope 1 and 2 emissions primarily. So scope 1 are direct emissions. That could be emissions from fleet or direct gas burning for industrial purposes or for heating buildings. And scope 2 is the emissions associated with purchased utilities, primarily electricity. So we can look at the impact of decarbonizing those elements of a company's processes. So starting with the scope 1, natural place to start. What are we burning directly? We can tackle that in this model by, let's say, electrifying our transport and our buildings and industry. So we're currently at 0.3 degrees of warming. We'll do a quick mental exercise. If we throw these sliders all the way to the right, we're strongly incentivizing electrification for both of these sectors. How much warming do we expect? Um, I think Praveen, you might have seen this before. So, Caitlin, I'm going to put you on the spot.
If where we're getting the energy to electrify is still like coal and oil, then I think we'd still see a bit higher, but not as much. But if we, fix our like a lower carbon grid, then I would definitely predict to see a bend in the curve.
Mhm. People who know their system dynamics. This is great. So, if we totally electrify transport and buildings and industry without touching anything else, we see a slight reduction because we're shifting from oil to electricity. But the sources of electricity are a combination of new renewables, more gas, and more coal. So exactly as you articulated, Caitlin, we are seeing a little bit of a benefit because this does stimulate some additional growth in the renewable sector, but all of those cars that were shifting from oil-based to coal-based are undermining that progress. Um, what happens if we throw in subsidies to renewables? How much does that bend the curve? You already predicted that that might help, but it still doesn't do as much as at least I thought it would, just looking at how much buzz there is around power purchase agreements. And they are important, right? Bringing clean electrons onto the grid, but it's not a silver bullet. Demand for energy continues to rise as people consume more, as economic growth allows people to consume more and, lead richer lives. Uh, and renewables alone cannot absorb all of that additional demand. And if you have fossil fuel infrastructure already on the grid and there isn't anything that's actively discouraging it, renewables will not go ahead and displace a lot of those fossil fuel sources of energy. But Praveen, you already gave us a preview of the next option, the next policy lever, which is thinking about a carbon price. And this is something that is embraced by economists because it moves us toward closer to a ideal market. Carbon emissions are currently represent a negative externality. So if we put a price on carbon that reflects the true cost to society of carbon emissions, then we can actually internalize those prices and the incentives become more aligned throughout the value chain. If we move this slider all the way to the right, that represents a carbon price of $250 per carbon dioxide ton equivalent. And if we do a comparison, the current price per carbon ton of carbon in the EU trading scheme is $56 per ton. So this is almost a five-fold increase over what that is. How much do we get? How much warming do we expect with a $250 per ton carbon price? Any guesses?
2.5.
What do you think, Caitlin?
Um, Probably, oh, yeah, I would say a little bit under 2.5 just for fun.
2.6. You're so close. So it's a very powerful lever. We can replay that change and see what happens. That makes it make a lot more sense to actually be taking those fossil fuel based sources of electricity offline and replacing them with renewables. It also effectively incentivizes efficiency. So we see the overall demand curve decreasing. And that's one of the really surprisingly powerful levers to decrease carbon emissions, but it's still not enough. We're still far away from that 2.0 goal, let alone 1.5. And the key thing here is market solutions just looking at carbon are not enough. Individual action by companies is not enough. I think this is a free tool. It's available for anyone to use with great documentation. So I encourage everyone to play around with it in their free time, their copious free time. But just to give you a preview of what it does take, we need to think about substantially increasing energy efficiency in transport and buildings. We need to do boost electrification in the building sector. We need to tackle other greenhouse gas sources such as agriculture, waste, deforestation, and we probably need to throw in investments in R&D to expand technological sources of carbon dioxide removal, such as direct air capture. We need to do afforestation, so add forest cover, have regenerative agriculture, probably incorporate some biochar, and there, that's what it takes to get to 1.5. It's basically everything. And to get to that scope, we need policy. You guys already knew that, but I feel like that lesson is something that the business community hasn't entirely absorbed, especially because of the implications for what that means for company action. So, how are companies influencing the policy space? I want to articulate this with a couple of case studies, starting off with Steve Marshall, the Republican Attorney General of the state of Alabama. Steve Marshall has been in office since his election in 2018, and during his time, he has been part of lawsuits that generally tend to limit the US's ability to tackle climate change. He participated in suits to maintain permits for the Keystone XL pipeline, which would lead to an additional 110 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year if completed. He supported a suit in trying to endanger or an amicus brief in support of the California Attorney General who is being sued for weakening the Endangered Species Act, the primary effect of which would be making more public land available for resource extraction. He filed briefs in support of the fossil fuel industry who's trying to prevent the state of Oregon from implementing their clean fuels program. He sued the Biden administration to we lost Caitlin. Okay, sued the Biden administration to restore leases for oil and gas drilling on public lands, and he sued the Biden administration, to prevent them from even calculating the social cost of carbon, which would be used in assessments on policy decisions such as setting a reasonable basis for a carbon tax, the most powerful lever for tackling climate action, which we just saw in the En-ROADS simulation. So each one of these cases serves to increase our emissions and accelerate the harm of climate change. So it might be surprising that at least 25 companies with an internal carbon reduction commitment made major contributions to getting him elected. How did that happen? Well, they provided donations through RAGA, the Republican Attorneys General Association, which is a national political advocacy group that can pool money from donors, including companies, and strategically allocate them to support attorney general elections. So let's look at those companies. This list was assembled by a watchdog group on political spending called the Center for Political Accountability. And they identified companies with at the time, internal carbon targets and over $100,000 in contributions to RAGA during that election. Now, some of these companies would probably be more aligned against political action on climate, such as Noble Energy and Exxon, but the list also includes companies that are trying to position themselves as climate leaders, such as Walmart, CVS, Coca-Cola, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Alphabet. The companies that we saw with climate action commitments at the beginning of this presentation, if you were paying attention. And it's also important to note that when a company makes donations to a group like RAGA, those donations are coming directly from treasury funds, which means one, they're coming from profits, and two, decisions about how these funds are allocated are often coming from individual managers, usually with little oversight from shareholders, let alone from a broader population of stakeholders. And these donations mattered. In this graph, we see the total of campaign contributions received by Steve Marshall versus his competition, which is the sum of his Republican challenger in the primary election and the Democratic opponent in the general. Raga, you see in the red bar, was Steve Marshall's single largest donor, contributing $735,000 to his campaign, which came in under 4 million. And that contribution alone was larger than the total amount raised by his Democratic challenger in the general election. And with that money, his war chest was substantially larger than his competition, which helped put him over the edge. And this difference in funding does make an impact. An analysis by an organization called Open Secrets looked at the winning percentage in races for the US Senate and the House of Representatives compared to funding levels. We see in the black line, the likelihood of success for the bigger funder in the Senate hovers around 80%, and it's well over 90% in the House. Now, if you're a statistical skeptic, you can look at this and say, well, correlation does not imply causation. Fair. But when we see, but in the down ballot races where the results depend a lot on publicity and name recognition, having more money matters. Having more of a marketing budget means people know to vote on something as obscure as the state attorney general. So I would argue Raga's contributions to Steve Marshall's campaign may well have been decisive. This is just one case study, but this mismatch between companies' stated policies on climate change and their political engagement happens again and again. We see a longer-term trend by looking at the role of industry associations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is an industry group that receives all of its funding through member companies in order to represent their interest in politics, at least in theory. The Chamber is the largest lobbying group in the United States and the largest source of untraceable campaign spending in the last decade. And their influence has consistently worked to block effective climate policy. So the image that we're seeing here represents an analysis by a think tank called Influence Map, who evaluated the quality and intensity of political engagement by companies and trade associations on climate policy. And they give a single score from A to F. And you can see in this graphic that the US Chamber of Commerce represents companies across the entire spectrum. You have the more negative on climate policy like Marathon and Phillips 66, all the way up to more leaders like Microsoft and Alphabet. And the US Chamber itself basically is on the end of the spectrum, not in the middle, but on the end of the spectrum, representing the lowest common denominator, the most aggressively against climate action. And remember, the Chamber funds its political activities through member companies' contributions. So this shows how even if a company's direct engagement on policy may be positive, they can still be funding a powerful lobbying group that is fighting against action on climate change. All right, that's one step out. One step out further, if we look at the entire spectrum of political activities by companies, we can see it has been overwhelmingly negative for climate. In fact, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said that entrenched interests and political influence by the corporate sector has been one of the leading barriers to passing effective climate policy. That paints a pretty dark picture of how the business world has been playing. But it's not all dark. There are examples of companies leading on climate action as recently as like 2 weeks ago. We have in the Trump administration, President Trump promised to roll back funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, which were earmarked funds that were earmarked for things like developing domestic battery production, subsidizing renewable energy developments, funding research in carbon capture and storage technologies, the types of things that we saw in the Edwards simulation model. And now, as part of its budgeting process, Congress is looking at, okay, how can we where do we actually want to do cuts, and how can that contribute to financing the extension of 2017 tax cuts? And normally you'd expect business to come down firmly in favor of tax cuts, but a group of 70 companies went to Washington to advocate for preserving IRA funding. On the one hand, you have common climate leaders like Amalgamated Bank, Danone, DSM-Firmenich, but you also have middle of the road companies like Bayer, DHL, and Ford, all saying this is investment that we want. And keep in mind that the Trump administration is comfortable with using maximum pressure policies against anyone that disagrees with them. So the fact that companies are stepping up here really represents leadership and an opportunity to identify common interests, places where it really is effective policy on many levels to preserve this funding. And they have decided to speak up. So that, I would say, represents climate policy leadership in action. So we see climate advocacy is possible, even in a challenging political context. But then why is there so much misalignment? And we could do this as a little interactive session. Praveen, any ideas that you want to throw out for what is driving some of this misalignment?
I think part of it's like knowledge. I'm sure like people who are in these people in these roles who are, they want to do the right thing, but they're not quite as
Mm-hmm.
politically savvy as they could be because they're at the end of the day, business operators. They're not lawyers, they're not politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. And understanding the implications of any piece of legislation is requires a lot of policy expertise, a lot of time, and predicting what impact that's going to have on the overall climate system requires a lot of technical knowledge. So it's complex to be able to say, hey, this is something that we would actually support. Any other drivers of misalignment?
I mean, probably the biggest one is obviously like profit, right? Like, okay, you want to do it's
Mhm.
kind of back to like the consumer, right? You want to do good in the world, but also like you're building to shareholders too that you want to increase your price over time. And if investing in the IRA or say renewable power purchase agreements means that you're going to take a dip, in the next quarter, then like push comes to shove, you're probably going to not go that way, unless you have other drivers that kind of push you that way.
Absolutely. It's a classic principal agent problem, collective action problem. We all need this problem to be solved because, as we talked about at the beginning, if we don't solve it, the entire thing collapses. The entire foundation of our economy doesn't work. And that is definitely going to affect profitability. But if I act unilaterally, then I am disproportionately bearing the costs. And it's it it can be done, but it's much harder to make the business case for that short-term benefit. Um, and how does that balance the short-term costs? So, and these are all very understandable, right? It's not that every corporation is being run by a bunch of baddies. It's that everyone is responding to their incentives and trying to do the best job that they can, but they are rewarded for prioritizing on profits, not rewarded necessarily for expanding their knowledge of climate action. And it's a as I as we see, it's a challenging political environment. So there are often consequences for companies that are speaking up. Um, but what are the risks when you end up with a mismatch between what a company is saying about climate science and the policies that they're advocating for?
This one's probably going to be natural disaster destruction, right? If
Mhm.
you're in real estate in Florida, if you're drilling oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico, wherever it might be, like very few companies are insulated from the natural world entirely.
Yeah. Or, I mean, we have, even with all of the localization that's happening in supply chains, we are still immensely globalized. So maybe your headquarters isn't in a wildfire, hurricane, tornado, polar vortex, flooding, drought, any of these hot spots. Um, but what are the odds that one of your critical suppliers is? Or what are the odds that there is a typhoon that happens at a port that then challenges global shipping lanes? Like it's because by virtue of being in a global system and a global set of supply chains, we are very exposed. That system level risk is becoming ever more tangible for companies. Um, anything, what about in the near term? What about reputational damage?
Yeah, PR risk, especially with the new generation becoming more aware and more like pro environmentalism writ large.
Hmm.
Say you want to hire the best talent, say you want to drive customer engagement. Like if they are aware that this is not actually a truly green company, especially if they're lying about their greening abilities, people will veer away from them.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You have um, higher expectations from younger employees. And if it turns out that the company that you're going to work for is not actually living up um, to their statements on climate change, then that creates a lot of disillusionment and undermines motivation. You see, when uh, that is a powerful motivating factor that gets people to put in that extra effort. When we talk about quiet quitting, like that's a recipe for quiet quitting. It also means that they have reputational impacts not just for their talent pipeline, for customers, for other stakeholders such as investors. Investors are increasingly looking to companies to step up as in climate policy leadership, and even the policymakers themselves. Like if you are seen as a credible player in the political space, if you are consistent as an actor with your statements consistently aligned, then your voice as a company actually has more sway when you want to have those policy engagements. Um, so that touches a lot of different stakeholders. So we could continue this conversation, but for the purposes of moving us along, I want to call out an analysis done by Amy Meyer and Elliot Misger at the World Resources Institute that looked at some of the drivers of this lack of leadership, um, and identified seven major barriers that we talked about. Praveen, you talked about the knowledge gap. Just it's hard to learn that level of detail, competing priorities, looking at short-term focus versus, okay, do I really want to pay for um, this thing in order to get this, or do I put my eggs in this other basket? That short-term, long-term trade-off, risk of political backlash. Um, and focus on quarterly earnings. Like there are all of these legitimate barriers that make it challenging to focus on climate leadership, but we also see that it is possible. Um, so how do companies move from being stuck and having these barriers to being able to take more active leadership? And that is where corporate political responsibility comes in. In the interest of time and of not putting Praveen on the spot too much more, we can go from this as a discussion question to a rhetorical question that we can answer right away. So, how should a corporation be engaged in political processes? We assert that a company is a valid participant in the political process. in a democracy, and companies represent voices in the democratic process, and their voices should have representation. But there should be some guardrails. And we assert that businesses should not undermine fundamental systems that we all rely on, that create the foundations of success for business and for everything, such as having competitive markets so that the winners are the ones that are more innovative, more effective. Basically, the whole idea of a free market, a stable democracy, because you need robust institutions to create the systems within which a market can thrive, and a livable planet, because without predictable weather, we see capitalism itself crumbling around us. And for that, we need a framework. Um, that foundational assertion is the idea of responsibility within the idea of corporate political responsibility. The Herb Institute at the University of Michigan launched a corporate political responsibility task force to develop this framework for what corporate political responsibility should look like, CPR for short. And these principles provide guidance for when and how companies should engage in politics. There are four pillars to this framework. It starts with legitimacy. The company needs a legitimate basis on which to engage in the policy process, whether the firm has contributed to the issue, or whether they've made a public commitment to it, or whether there are severe consequences of the issue to the firm. There should be accountability, that public engagement needs to be grounded in the company's principles. It needs to be in line with its commitments to all of its stakeholders, and there needs to be robust governance around it. Responsibility, of course, that companies should avoid jeopardizing those fundamental systems, and transparency, that companies should disclose what they're doing. And right now, a lot of political activities can legally and consistently happen in the dark, which doesn't help with trust or demonstrate accountability. And this applies to all political activities, including spending, political spending, lobbying, internal and external communications, and it's both direct activities that the company is doing and their work through third-party associations. This is ethics. We need to eliminate policies which serve immediate interests of companies at the expense of the long-term health of the system that creates the conditions for prosperity. And that can help address the risks that we talked about earlier. It helps if we have these responsible policy engagements, then companies contribute to creating policies that help address those system level risks. We don't have the same acceleration of climate change, so we don't face, again, the erosion of the financial system. And it helps address firm level risks. You can help the company is more intentional about about weighing these trade-offs in the political process so they can avoid falling into a hypocrisy trap that helps build and maintain trust with employees and customers. They can anticipate and avoid investor focus and pressure, and it helps them become more credible players in the policy space. So what can you do about it? We believe that students are a key player in this process. And our vision for change starts with you. It starts with you as actors applying levers in the short term, directly engaging with companies, and in the longer term through universities. So in the short term, students represent the talent pipeline. Praveen, you referenced this earlier, that this is something that companies really care about. Recruiting is critical for the long-term success, even the short-term success of companies. So even in a challenging job market, company reputation matters because the top talent is always going to be highly sought after. We aim to create positive competition among companies to recruit top talent based on their corporate political responsibility. An example of this working effectively is a group called Law Students for Climate Accountability. They create a scorecard every year rating law firms from A to F based on their support for the fossil fuel industries. And through this work, they have been contacted by top scoring firms who want to use the scorecard as part of their promotional materials. So actually saying, hey, we are advertising, we are attracting talent on the basis of this positive score. And they've been contacted by low scoring firms who ask how they can improve their score. So it works on both dimensions. We are currently working on developing a similar scoring system for companies based on their policy engagement on climate. So that's the short-term lever. The long-term lever, we want to establish CPR as a new expectation for business, and universities play a critical role in shaping that kind of convention. You, students, are customers of your universities, and we want you to use that power as customers to shape the curriculum, because we hear again and again that that is what drives curriculum change. As customers, you can work to embed CPR into business education so that you and your classmates can learn about these dynamics, become practitioners in navigating this complex political landscape, so that you take your learnings into the workforce and up the corporate ladder, so that you can effectively handle the risks that we talked about earlier. And very concretely, we want everyone watching this to get involved in our work. On the company focus, we launched a case competition this earlier, or this past academic year called the ESG Dilemma Design Challenge, looking at how banks can deploy CPR. And we are developing the CPR scorecard I just mentioned. On the university focus, we are working with students to integrate CPR into existing business courses, and we have a roadmap developed by one of our volunteers how you can bring in a CPR-focused case study into conventional business school classes. And we've developed a standalone half-term course focused on CPR that can be adapted and incorporated into your curriculum. But to make this easy, if you're interested in staying in touch or in getting involved, shoot me a quick email with hello, and I will follow up. And with that, I hope that after watching this video, you believe that policy is key to tackling climate change, that companies do, in fact, play an important role in influencing policy, that this influence has been largely negative, but if companies adhere to the framework for corporate political responsibility, companies can support action on climate and will be able to align their true policy footprint with the necessary policies for a livable planet, and that you can make a difference. So thank you for your time and attention. Thanks to Praveen for hosting this event.